The diner was bustling with the usual chatter, the smell of sizzling food filling the air. But today it wasn't the food or the conversation that captured everyone's attention, it was the biker. Grinning arrogantly, he leaned over the counter, berating the young waitress, Sarah, who was just trying to do her job. His insults rang out, loud and cruel as the room fell silent. Sarah's face flushed with humiliation, her hands trembling as she tried to keep her composure. No one dared intervene until a familiar voice broke the tension. "That's enough," John Cena said, stepping into the diner. The room froze. What happened next would change everything. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get started. The clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation filled the small diner, a place Sarah had worked at for over 2 years. She was used to the steady rhythm, the routine of taking orders, refilling coffee mugs, and greeting familiar faces. But today, everything felt different. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter tighter than usual, the cool metal biting into her skin as she tried to steady her nerves. She was only 22, and every part of her longed to prove she could handle the weight of her job. But today there was an edge to the tension. The biker's voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of the diner like a knife. His words, each one dripping with condescension, rang in Sarah's ears, stinging with their cruelty. She had heard insults before. Customers were rarely kind. But something about this felt different. The way he sneered at her, as if she were less than human, made her stomach twist with frustration. "Can't you do anything right?" His voice boomed, a smirk dancing on his lips as he leaned over the counter. Sarah's throat tightened. The taste of bitter coffee lingered on her tongue, but it didn't bring comfort like it usually did. She focused on the coffee pot in her hand, pouring another cup for a customer a few feet away, her hands trembling just enough that the liquid sloshed over the edge. Her thoughts spiraled. Why can't I just ignore him? Why is this getting to me so much? She had always been told to be the bigger person, but today the words cut deeper than they ever had before. It wasn't just the insult, it was the feeling of powerlessness, the helplessness that surged within her. The feeling of being smaller than she really was. She hated it. As she wiped down the counter again, her eyes flicked toward the door. It was a habit, a way of breaking away from the tension in the air. The bell above the door jingled softly, unnoticed at first, but then there it was, a booming voice, full of authority, cutting through the biker's taunts. "That's enough." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her head snapped toward the source of the voice, the feeling of panic and relief crashing through her at once. The room, which had been holding its breath just moments before, now collectively exhaled. The words, simple yet powerful, echoed in her mind. John Cena. The figure that stood at the entrance was unmistakable. Tall, imposing, and unshakable. For the first time that day, Sarah allowed herself to breathe, though she was unsure whether the relief was from the intervention or from the hope that maybe she wasn't as powerless as she had believed. The biker paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he registered the voice that had broken through his tirade. Sarah's pulse quickened. She didn't know who it was at first, but the force behind the words made her heart skip. The man standing at the entrance of the diner wasn't just anyone. It was John Cena, the famous wrestler turned actor, and his towering presence immediately commanded attention. His broad shoulders filled the doorframe, casting a shadow that seemed to push the tension in the room back just slightly. The biker's smirk faltered just for a moment, but quickly returned as he turned to face Cena. "What, you think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do?" His voice was a mixture of surprise and defiance, as if the very idea of anyone challenging him was absurd. Cena didn't flinch. "I think you've crossed a line, my friend," he said, his tone calm but firm. "This woman," he motioned to Sarah, who stood frozen behind the counter, "is trying to do her job. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not in front of others." Sarah felt the sting of the biker's words like an echo in her chest. Her face flushed with a mix of shame and relief. Shame because it felt too good to be true, too surreal. Relief because, for once, someone cared enough to step in. "Mind your business, Cena," the biker growled, the venom in his voice rising. He stood up straighter, puffing his chest as if to intimidate Cena. But Cena's presence didn't waver. "I'm making it my business," Cena responded coolly, not backing down an inch. "What's your problem with her? What makes you think it's okay to humiliate a waitress just doing her job?" The biker's eyes flickered with anger, but there was something else in them too. Fear, maybe? Sarah wasn't sure. The biker took a step forward, chest still puffed out, clearly sizing Cena up. The room was so still, you could almost hear the beat of her own heart, thumping against her ribs. Everyone was watching, waiting for what would happen next. "She didn't deserve your attitude, and neither do the rest of these people," Cena continued. His voice was still low, but it carried the weight of authority. Sarah could hear the firmness, the justice in his words. It was like a sudden gust of wind had knocked the arrogance out of the biker. For a second, Sarah saw the biker hesitate. His posture faltered, and for the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. He looked around the room, realizing that all eyes were on him. The diner, once filled with whispers and the clink of silverware, now felt silent. Every single person had stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. "Just leave her alone, all right?" Cena's voice dropped to a more personal, almost pleading tone. "She doesn't deserve your crap." The biker sneered, but Sarah could see the cracks in his bravado. His eyes flickered toward the door, then back at Cena. His pride was on the line. "I don't need to take this from you." His voice shook just enough that Sarah caught the hint of doubt creeping into his words. And then, with a snarl, he spun on his heel, storming out of the diner. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound still ringing in the air long after he had gone. The room slowly exhaled, the tension lifting as everyone went back to their meals, murmuring amongst themselves. Sarah stood frozen, her hands trembling as she clutched the rag in her hand. She could still feel the sting of the biker's insults, but now something else lingered in her chest, a strange mixture of awe and gratitude. Cena had stepped in, had taken a stand, and it made her realize something she had never thought of before. She wasn't alone. The warmth of Cena's words still echoed in her mind as she looked around the room, feeling the weight of the kindness that had just been extended to her. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just someone to be humiliated. She was a person deserving of respect. The days after the incident with the biker felt strangely surreal to Sarah. On the one hand, there was a growing sense of strength, of confidence she had never experienced before. Cena's words kept echoing in her mind. "You don't deserve this, Sarah." But on the other hand, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling of vulnerability that still clung to her. The biker's humiliating words had left deeper scars than she had initially realized. Her internal struggle was one she hadn't expected. She wanted to feel empowered, to stand tall and proud in the face of adversity, but a part of her still feared the weight of being underestimated. She stood behind the counter at the diner the next afternoon, her hands shaking as she set down a coffee cup in front of a customer. The rhythmic clink of porcelain against the counter should have been soothing, but instead, it only amplified the chaos inside her mind. She had no idea what had driven the biker to treat her so cruelly that day, but as the hours passed, the questions only multiplied. Why did people like him feel entitled to degrade others? Did she, somehow, deserve it? Her mind was clouded with doubts she couldn't ignore. When Cena had stepped in, everything had changed for a moment. Yet now, everything felt just as fragile. She was still Sarah the waitress, still the same person who had endured the insult. Cena had been the hero, but she had yet to fully believe that she was worth the intervention. Wasn't she just a waitress? Someone meant to serve, meant to be invisible? She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. The same biker had walked past the diner a few days ago. His eyes had locked with hers for a brief second and he didn't even look away. It sent a chill up her spine, a feeling that refused to go away. What if he came back? What if there was another confrontation? What if he decides he's going to make my life a living hell for standing up to him? Her thoughts were interrupted when a customer, a regular, asked for the check. She smiled through the unease, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. She had to stay professional. She had to stay strong. The diner's atmosphere was tense. In a way she hadn't noticed before. Word had gotten around about the incident with the biker, and the other customers treated her with a kind of cautious sympathy. They would smile at her, but there was always a sense of distance. It was as if they didn't want to get too close, in case they might get involved in something they weren't prepared for. "Hey, Sarah, you okay?" Linda, a fellow waitress, asked as she came over to refill Sarah's coffee pot. Linda's voice was soft, but there was an edge of concern in it. Sarah forced a smile, nodding quickly. "I'm fine, just working through things," Sarah replied, her voice a little shaky. "You know, you don't have to put on that smile for me," Linda said gently, her eyes searching Sarah's face. "You don't have to pretend you're okay when you're not." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to talk about it, not now. Not when the weight of it all was still so fresh. But Linda's concern was too genuine to ignore. "She's right. I'm not okay. I can't keep pretending that I'm fine when I'm falling apart inside. I'm just scared," Sarah admitted quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I don't know if I can handle it if he comes back. If someone like him can treat me like that, what's to stop anyone else?" Linda set the coffee pot down on the counter and placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's arm. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. You stood up to him once, didn't you? And Cena. Cena gave you strength, but you had it in you all along. The next time he walks in here, you won't need anyone else to fight your battles." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Every ounce of her being wanted to believe Linda, to find comfort in those words, but the fear still gnawed at her. The fear that she would be humiliated again, that someone would see her as weak, that she would fail to defend herself. It wasn't just the biker. It was the world outside this diner, A world where women like her were often silenced, dismissed, and overlooked, where the opinions of others mattered more than her own self-respect. In her mind, it felt like a battle she couldn't win, no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise. The diner was quieter than usual when she heard the familiar sound of the door opening. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned instinctively toward the entrance. It wasn't the biker this time, but the familiar sight of a regular customer, a businessman in a suit, walking in. He flashed her a smile as he passed, but for a moment she saw it again. The judgment, the quiet dismissal in his eyes. She quickly turned back to her work, the weight of it all pressing on her chest. It wasn't just one person, one biker, or even Cena's intervention that would solve this. It was going to be a constant struggle, a constant fight, to maintain her dignity, to remind herself that she was more than the sum of her job, her appearance, and the opinions others held of her. But how could she change the way others saw her when she didn't even believe in herself yet? How could she stand up for herself when the voice of doubt was still so loud inside her head? The question echoed in her mind, unanswered and terrifying. But as the diner's bustle continued around her, Sarah knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep hiding. She couldn't keep pretending she wasn't worthy of respect. The world was full of challenges, but for once, she wasn't going to run from them. The sound of the doorbell jingled again. Sarah barely looked up, continuing to scrub down the counter with a practiced hand. She could feel the tension creeping back into her muscles as she awaited the inevitable. Was it him? The biker? Would today be the day he came back to finish what he had started? But when the heavy boots finally walked in, Sarah froze. It wasn't the biker. It was Cena. John Cena. Standing tall at the door of the diner, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. He wasn't just a celebrity, a hero from the television screen. He was here, in her world, in the very space where she had felt so small, so vulnerable. The air around Sarah thickened, the smells of fried food and brewed coffee suddenly distant and irrelevant. It felt like time had stopped. Her heart hammered against her chest as Cena made his way toward her. Every step he took sent a shockwave of realization through her. He had come for her. Again. "Hey," Cena said, his voice calm but purposeful, a stark contrast to Sarah's racing pulse. "Can I get a seat by the window?" It was almost absurd, the casualness in his words. Here she was, fighting internal wars, trying to piece together her own strength. And here he was, acting as if it was the most normal thing in the world to walk in and just be there. The nervous energy that had been swirling in Sarah's body started to fade, replaced by something else, something raw. She realized, in that moment, that Cena's presence wasn't just comforting. It was a reflection of something much deeper. It was a challenge. The moment she had been waiting for wasn't an external confrontation. It was right in front of her, with every word Cena spoke, every action he made. He sat down, casually scanning the menu as if nothing had happened. The quiet hum of the diner resumed, but Sarah's mind was racing. She had expected this moment, the moment when the biker would come back, when she'd have to face him once again. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would stand her ground. But Cena had shifted the dynamic. He had taken her from being the subject of someone else's humiliation to being someone who was seen, not just in a literal sense, but emotionally, deeply. He had reminded her of her worth, her strength. But now, the true test lay before her. She walked to his table slowly, her hands steadying themselves on the edge of the tray she was holding. As she stood before him, the world seemed to shrink around them, the sounds of chattering voices and clinking dishes fading into the background. "How's your day going?" Cena asked, as if they were two regular people sharing a quiet moment. But Sarah wasn't a regular person. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She was enough. She had been enough all along. Cena wasn't here to save her. He was here to show her that she didn't need saving. Not from the biker, not from anyone. He had opened her eyes to something she had forgotten, the power within her to change her own story. "I'm good," Sarah finally managed to say, her voice calm yet steady. A warmth began to fill her chest, a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. "Better than good, actually." Cena smiled, and for a moment, it wasn't the smile of a celebrity, a hero. It was just a man, recognizing the quiet strength in a woman who had found her courage. "That's good to hear," he said, his tone softer now. For the first time, Sarah didn't feel the pressure to be something she wasn't. She wasn't trying to prove herself to anyone. The realization didn't come with a loud burst or a dramatic shift. It was subtle, quiet. It was the recognition that she was more than the role people expected her to play. She didn't need anyone else's approval to define her worth. As Cena stood to leave, he offered her a final look, one that seemed to say, "You're going to be just fine." And for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed it. She watched him walk out the door, but this time, she wasn't the one left behind. It wasn't just Cena who had changed things. It was her. Her willingness to face the fear head on, to stop running from the shame, and embrace her own power. The twist wasn't that Cena had come to rescue her. The twist was that she had rescued herself. The diner was still the same. The world outside still moved on. But Sarah stood a little taller, her heart a little fuller. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was Sarah, the woman who had found her strength, no longer afraid to stand up for herself. The days following the incident with Cena passed by slowly, almost as though time itself had been altered. Sarah found herself replaying that moment over and over in her mind, the way her pulse had steadied when she realized she didn't need to be rescued. The sense of empowerment still lingered, but with it came a quiet storm of reflection. Had she truly changed? Or was this just a fleeting moment that would fade like so many others? Each morning, when Sarah arrived at the diner, the weight of her past seemed to press down on her. But it was no longer crushing. It was a familiar heaviness that now felt like a part of her, one she had learned to carry, rather than one that dragged her down. The biker had not returned, but his presence still lingered in Sarah's thoughts. She knew that, at any moment, the shame, the humiliation, could return like a familiar enemy. But something was different now. It wasn't just Cena's intervention that had shifted her. It was the quiet realization that she had been capable of standing her ground all along. When she looked at herself in the mirror now, she didn't just see a waitress. She saw a woman who had faced the worst of what life had thrown at her and had emerged with something more than just survival. She had emerged with strength. One afternoon, as Sarah wiped down a table near the window, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face walking into the diner. It was Jennifer, one of her old friends from high school. They hadn't spoken much since Sarah had moved to the city to start over, but Jennifer had always been a kind presence in her life. She was also a few years older and had already gone on to a more stable life, one that seemed far removed from the turmoil Sarah had endured. Jennifer waved with a wide grin, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia. She hadn't realized how much she missed her until this moment. Jennifer slid into a booth, and Sarah hesitated for a moment before walking over. When she approached, Jennifer's face lit up. "Wow, Sarah, it's been forever," she said, her tone warm with genuine surprise. "Yeah, it has," Sarah replied, the smile on her face not quite reaching her eyes. "You still keeping busy with that law firm?" Jennifer nodded, her eyes sparkling with pride. "You know it. Just a few more years until I make partner. How about you? How's the diner life treating you?" Sarah chuckled softly. "It's been good. I've learned a lot, you know." Jennifer raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing the deeper meaning behind Sarah's words. "You seem different. You okay?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than Sarah expected. She hadn't really thought about how others might perceive her changes. In the past, she might have deflected or avoided such a personal inquiry. But this time, she found herself wanting to share, if only to understand the shift that had occurred within her. "I'm better," Sarah began slowly, still testing the words. "I guess I've just realized that I don't need anyone to tell me who I am or how strong I can be." Jennifer's expression softened. "You always were stronger than you gave yourself credit for." Sarah blinked, taken aback by the simple yet profound honesty in her friend's words. Jennifer had always been kind, but she had never spoken to Sarah like this, like she truly understood the fight that Sarah had been enduring all along. "I didn't see it before," Sarah confessed. "I spent so much time trying to hide from everything, my past, my insecurities, everything that made me feel small. But now I see it differently. I'm not weak because I've struggled. I'm strong because of it." Jennifer's smile was slow, but it was knowing. "You're not alone, you know. We all have our own battles. The difference is you're learning to fight." The words struck a chord with Sarah. She hadn't realized until now just how much her journey had been about self-acceptance. She had been so caught up in trying to survive, to outrun the shame, that she hadn't seen how much she had grown. Cena's intervention had been a catalyst, but the real transformation had taken place within her. It was a shift that didn't happen overnight, but in the quiet, subtle moments when she allowed herself to simply be. As Sarah refilled Jennifer's coffee cup, her mind wandered back to the diner, to the memories of that day with the biker. She had no idea if he would ever show up again, but for the first time, she didn't fear the idea of it. If he did, she would face him not as a victim, but as someone who had found her power in the most unexpected of places. "You really do look different," Jennifer remarked, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. "I mean it. It's like you've got a new fire in your eyes." Sarah smiled, this time more confidently, the weight in her chest a little lighter than before. "I guess I do." And it was true. She was different. The past hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, waiting in the shadows, but Sarah no longer felt as if it controlled her. It had shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her. And that made all the difference. Jennifer stood up, reaching for her purse. "I'm really glad to see you doing better, Sarah. You deserve it." "Thanks, Jen," Sarah replied, watching her friend leave. The diner felt quieter somehow, but the silence was comforting now. As she returned to her work, she reflected on the conversation and the weight of it. She was no longer the person she had been when she first walked into this diner. She had crossed an invisible threshold, and the world felt different, more expansive, even in the confines of the same old diner. She had chosen to stop being a passive participant in her own life. She had chosen to take control, and now she was living it. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited for what came next. As the days continued to pass, Sarah found herself standing at a crossroads. The diner, once a symbol of her past struggles, now felt like a place of renewal. She had learned to embrace the lessons that had come from her hardships. The silence that had once felt suffocating was now filled with purpose. Each morning as she arrived to prepare for her shift, there was a quiet confidence in her step, something she hadn't had before. She no longer feared the judgment or the whispers of others. She had come to realize that the only opinion that truly mattered was her own. Sarah had spent so much time trying to prove herself to others, trying to escape the narrative that had been written for her. But now, she had rewritten that story, page by page, with her actions and choices. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the author of her own life. One afternoon, as the diner buzzed with activity, the door opened with a familiar jingle. Sarah didn't need to look up to know who it was. The biker from that day had returned. But this time, she didn't feel the rush of fear she had once felt. She felt nothing but the quiet strength that had been cultivated within her over time. As he walked to the counter, Sarah gave him a single, unbothered glance. He stopped in his tracks when their eyes met. There was no sneer, no aggressive stance. Instead, there was an awkward silence, as if he, too, sensed the shift in the air. He was no longer the intimidating figure he had once been. He was just another person, standing in the same space as her, without the power to make her feel small. He cleared his throat, his voice a little less sure this time. I'll take the usual." Sarah nodded, her expression neutral. She didn't need to say anything more. His apology wasn't necessary. It wasn't for him to offer. It was for her to accept. And she had long since learned that forgiveness, much like strength, wasn't something that was given. It was something that she took when she was ready. The realization hit Sarah quietly, but it was profound. Her transformation wasn't just about standing up to others. It was about standing up for herself. She didn't need validation from anyone, not even the people who had once tried to diminish her. Her growth had been in learning that her worth was not tied to others' perceptions. It had been a lesson of self-love, of taking back control in the most vulnerable of places. As the biker took his seat at the counter, Sarah went about her work, no longer looking over her shoulder or anticipating the worst. There was a sense of peace in the way she moved, a quiet assurance in the way she handled the mundane moments of her day. She wasn't waiting for life to surprise her anymore. She had learned to be the surprise. Later that evening, as she locked up and stepped outside, Sarah breathed in the cool air, feeling it fill her lungs in a way that was almost foreign, but deeply grounding. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, taking in the city around her, feeling a sense of quiet pride. She had changed, not just on the surface, but deep inside, where it mattered most. She had learned that the real strength wasn't in fighting back against the world. It was in finding peace within herself, no matter what life threw at her. With the setting sun casting a warm glow over the streets, Sarah smiled, knowing that she had grown into something stronger, more resilient. It was a bittersweet feeling, knowing that her past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She was free to move forward, to chase whatever came next. And for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. This was only the beginning. What would you do if you were in Sarah's shoes? Could you stand tall in the face of humiliation, knowing that your self-worth isn't defined by others? Sarah's journey teaches us that true strength comes not from fighting on the battles around us, but from finding peace within ourselves. It's a reminder that no matter how small or big the struggles we face may seem, we have the power to rewrite our story. If you've ever had a moment where you felt powerless, how did you find your strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the power of self-love and resilience. If you found inspiration in Sarah's transformation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the strength we all have within.